Good morning. One of the struggles that we all face at the moment is this disconnection from familiar routines and institutions, or routines and places. Obviously, as a church, our routine and our place on Sunday morning have changed. But for many of us, our workplaces have also changed. The family and the friends that we visit have also changed. The places, or maybe the times that we vacation, have changed this year. Nowhere do we see this lack of stability more than in all the fuss and the changes and the toing and froing about school schedules and should the schools open or not, or hybrid models, all of this. It's complicated, it's going to be messy for families, messy for children, messy for teachers, and obviously we have teachers that it directly impacts you, and it often seems that there's no good solution. No one wants to get the coronavirus. You never know whether you're going to have mild symptoms or serious symptoms, or someone you love will have serious symptoms. So doing everything we can to avoid it is messy, but getting it might be really messy, and it's just unknown. And so we're kind of left adrift. And that's the sermon series that we're beginning, Adrift. I know it's one word, not very descriptive, but I think it kind of fits that we're drifting, not knowing where we can settle down, not knowing what's true. I don't know about you, but there's so much information from so many different places that who knows what numbers or information we can trust. It's just really difficult to navigate life at the moment. I'm sitting down and in a chair today because I really feel like we're kind of telling a story, recapping the Old Testament, and it's not really a sermon that we're preaching that I want to fire you up, but I do hope that by the end of today I can give you something to hang on to. I can give you a direction in which to head. The vast majority of the Old Testament, and that's what we're going to be talking about the next few weeks, concerns the people of God, Israel, collecting anchors, collecting things they could hang on to, finding stability in their land and cementing their relationship with God. Over time, Israel grows from one man and his wife, Abraham and Sarah, to a large nation. They grow from Abraham and Sarah being nomads, moving with their herds from place to place, living in tents, to a nation owning their own land that they've fought battles for, taken possession of, populated, settled, built cities, established farms and whatever industry they could. They've captured Jerusalem and claimed it for their own. They've constructed a glorious temple. They have godly kings. They have respect, maybe respect or fear from their neighbors. And they've reached this pinnacle as a nation. But from that pinnacle, from that point at the top, they begin a descent. The kings and the nation turn to worship idols. And so even as the political, economic, and military power of the nation declines, at least they still have these anchors of the land that they live in. They still have the temple in Jerusalem that they can point to. And if they choose, they still have God's law that He gave them in the wilderness at Mount Sinai. There are three great national anchors that, regardless of whatever else is going on around them, they can keep coming back to these and saying, here's our stability, here's our identity, and for those who are faithful, here's our God and our assurance of God's faithfulness to us, that we are in fact His special people. During the centuries of decline into ungodliness, Yahweh sends prophets. He doesn't just stand back and let them decline. He sends prophets, and they call out and they say, "Hey, Israel, come back, change your trajectory. If you keep going down and down and down, you're going to lose your land. You're going to lose Jerusalem. You're going to lose that glorious temple in Jerusalem." And the nation refuses to listen. In fact, they persecute the prophets. They imprison them. They beat them. They reject them. In some cases, they apparently killed them. And so what the prophets predicted takes place. Jerusalem is destroyed. The world power of Babylon comes from over in the region of Iraq, modern-day Iraq, and they bring their armies down through Syria, Lebanon, into Judah, and they destroy Jerusalem. They take the kings and the nobility and the academics and the elite, they take them back to Babylon. And they just leave the uneducated to live there in the ruins of Jerusalem. And when the Israelites were taken in chains back to Babylon, they found themselves adrift. No king, no country, no temple. Everything that they had built their identity upon was gone. The Israelites had been brought kicking and screaming across the plains, across the thousands of miles from Jerusalem to Babylon. And so now how should they respond as they're settled? They probably did a lot of manual labor and menial jobs there in Babylon, at least at first, but how should they respond to living in this city? It was a pagan city filled with idolatry, filled with witchcraft, filled with all sorts of morals that were so different from God's morals. Maybe not different from the morals that they had practiced, but certainly different from God's morals. How should they think about the language and the culture in which they're now immersed? Do they want to continue to speak their own language? Do they want to continue to keep the festivals and the feasts that they have kept as a nation for centuries? Or do they start celebrating the pagan holidays that are connected to astrology and to pagan gods? How are they going to integrate into this new environment, new culture in which they find themselves? And so in addition to those, there are questions to the cultural and language questions that any immigrant faces. They also have questions about religion. What are they to do about religion? Now you say, well, they were taken into captivity because they stopped worshiping God. What do they care? But for many, this served as a wake-up call. And the questions of God and religion and the messages of the prophets kept coming. God continued to speak to them and be present in their lives. And so they have to make these decisions about how they're going to live. But even at a more fundamental level, beyond all the adjustments they're going to need to make, is this question of, given that they're living in captivity, given that they're living in Babylon, did they even have a reason to believe that Yahweh was truly God? The fact that their God had apparently been defeated by the Babylonian God, you would think would be grounds for some to say, well, Yahweh isn't real, and just to walk away. So today we're going to look at the situation of these people. They're Jews living in Babylon. And we're going to look at their circumstances through the eyes of the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah was a prophet in Jerusalem. before the Babylonian army came and attacked. And he warned the kings. He said, the Babylonians are going to come. You need to turn around. You need to get back to worshiping God. You need to destroy your idols. You have been unfaithful. You have been an adulterous wife to God. You need to get back to God. Restore that relationship. Turn around. But they didn't. And so the Babylonians came. Jeremiah was there in Jerusalem during the siege of Jerusalem. And it was a terrible siege. People resorted to cannibalism, to eating, to killing infants. I mean, it was like whatever you think is the worst kind of siege, that's what it was like. And after the city was destroyed, Jeremiah was one of those left behind. He didn't go to Babylon. He stayed there in the ruins, and he continued to encourage people to turn to God. But they said, no, we're going to trust our own wisdom. We're going to trust our own advice. They even at one point came to him and said, Jeremiah, tell us what God says. We'll do whatever you tell us. And he prophesied to them. He said, stay in Jerusalem. Be faithful. God will do right by you. And when they heard it, they said, oh, no, we're out of here. And they kidnapped Jeremiah and they took him down to Egypt. And so Jeremiah was there before the siege, during the siege, after the destruction, and then was kidnapped and taken to Egypt, and he prophesied even down there in Egypt. Truly a long tenured prophet, a remarkable prophet, and really a failure as a prophet, because no one listened to anything that he said. And yet he stuck at it. And we have his writings today. So God respected his ministry, respected all that he did, and preserved it for us to continue to learn from today. Mostly he was a doom and gloom kind of prophet. He pointed out sin. He made enemies. He predicted destruction. He received persecution. He was beaten. He was thrown into wells. He was put in prisons. And yet he never gave up speaking for God. The Jews taken to Babylon, let's just go back to them for a moment. They're living there in Babylon, and they face this decision between two extremes. How are they going to adjust to their new circumstances? Okay, what's going to happen? Everything is new. They've got they're adrift. They've got to start over. They've got limited resources. And so the first option they face is they could simply assimilate into that dominant Babylonian culture. They could become Babylonian. They could live as Babylonians. They could worship as Babylonians, and maybe over time marry Babylonians, be accepted as Babylonians. That's an option. And there were certainly Jews who chose that option. Then there's another choice. I call it number 2. Their second choice was they could withdraw. They could become a kind of holy huddle there in Babylon. They could establish a community that no one else could enter, that they left as little as possible, and they could maintain their unique worship. They could maintain their cultural values, their language, their festivals, and they could make it obvious that they disapproved of everything around them, that the Babylonians were clearly ungodly, evil people. And they could spend their Sabbaths remembering the good old days, wishing for Jerusalem and the grandeur of that temple that Solomon built. So they're their choices: assimilate or separate. Now, Jeremiah is the longest book in the Bible. Now, I know Psalms has 150 chapters, Isaiah has an awful lot as well, but if you count the words, Jeremiah is actually the longest. It has more words in it than either Isaiah or Psalms. And a common trait of ancient literature is that when you get a book like this, that you can look at the middle of the book. And the most important information is oftentimes placed right there in the middle of the book. It's kind of like you build up to the main point and then you wind down and maybe apply it or contrast with it, whatever you do. But the emphasis is there in the middle. So, I'm sure that you're all saying, Peter, tell us what's in the middle of Jeremiah. That's a good question. I'm glad you asked. The answer is hope. Hope. Jeremiah, this prophet who was doom and gloom, talking about sin and destruction and judgment, who lived a miserable life of hardship and faithfulness to God, has at the center of his message hope. In chapter 29 of Jeremiah, he is still living in the ruins of Jerusalem, and he writes a letter to the exiles in Babylon. And here is the message that God has given Jeremiah to send over to Babylon, to the people living over there. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there. Do not decrease. Also, seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. That's Jeremiah 29 verses 5 through 7. So it sounds pretty ordinary, right? To plant a garden, to get married, have kids. Nothing real extreme there. But picture, if you would, how that sounds if you're part of that holy huddle. People that want to listen to God. The ones that are assimilating, they're not listening to God. But Jeremiah's message from God is going to be particularly of interest to those that are leaning towards this separation from Babylonian culture. They're hoping to go back. And Jeremiah, just a few verses later, talks about it'll be 70 years before you can go back. Most of you will die. And he says, live for your children and for your grandchildren. And so his message to these people that want to separate is don't separate. Don't become this group of strangers. Instead, integrate into Babylonian culture. Integrate into the life of the city. Settle in the pagan nation. Even though your natural inclination is not to, even though your natural inclination is to say, no, my identity is as an Israelite, and an Israelite belongs in Israel, and I am a child of God, and God gave that land to his children, and that's where I need to be. That's where the temple was. What are we going to do here in Babylon? Even with that mindset, God says, no, be content where you are. Integrate into the life of the community. Don't assimilate, don't become like them, but be involved with them. Don't be always looking over your shoulder for better times. Look ahead for your children and for your grandchildren. Expect to be here a long time, because even in 70 years, not everyone is going to go back. There was a Jewish community there in Babylon, in that region, for a long time, well past the 70 years. Even more radical than just planting a garden, getting married, building houses, more radical than that is the second part of this instruction that God gives through Jeremiah. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city to which I have carried you. Pray to the Lord for it. Why would we want to seek the prosperity of Babylon? Didn't they just destroy Jerusalem? They don't deserve to prosper. And in fact, later on in the book of Jeremiah is going to talk about all sorts of judgment that will rain down on Babylon. But that's God's business. The Jews' business, living there in Babylon, is to seek the prosperity of the city, the peace and prosperity, to be involved in the life of the city, to be productive members of society. God doesn't want his people to withdraw from society, to withdraw from the community in which we live. And there are times that I look at our cultural values and I don't know that I can connect. I feel adrift of what's going on TikTok or Twitter or wherever it is, that I don't connect with the world around me. I feel like a stranger. The music, the fashion, the sexuality, the sensuality, the prejudice, the disrespect, the anger. It feels like I'm drifting. And it would be easier to stay in my holy huddle. It would be easier to stay in my boat and to ride out the waves and hopefully just land on the golden shore someday than to try and engage society with all of the difficulties that come with that, with everything that is ungodly that I see going on around me. I know people that say, how can Christians bring children into this world? What sort of future are they giving them? It's too ungodly. But it's not as ungodly as Babylon was. Babylon was as bad, worse than American society today. And in that context of Babylon, God told his people specifically to marry and have children and have grandchildren and trust him to take care of them in the years ahead. Plan for a positive future and don't look back. And so the example for us is clear. Be a positive presence wherever you find yourself. Seek to influence our community without being influenced by it. And even when ungodliness is predominant, pray for the peace and the prosperity of our city, of our society. And I think this applies during a pandemic also, not just when we look at moral decay or whatever we choose to focus on around us. During a pandemic, as we isolate, as we hunker down, there's temptation to hunker down so much that we don't care about the people around us, that it's every man and woman and child and family for themselves. And we focus on our own needs rather than the needs of our neighbors. Perhaps the most well-known verse in Jeremiah is also found in this middle section, this section of hope in Jeremiah over in chapter 31 and verse 31 and 33. I'm going to read, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." We may not completely grasp the significance of this promise as Gentiles, but to the Jews, this would have sounded astonishing to them. The temple was gone and God said nothing about replacing it here. Jerusalem was gone and God said, get used to Babylon. The land was gone and God said, build homes and plant vineyards and have children and enjoy your location where you are. The promise, now God is saying, the law is gone. The covenant that he made with them at Sinai, that they had broken as a nation, that had been the reason they were in exile, God says, I'm going to replace it. Well, the Jews had thought that they knew the way back to Jerusalem. All they had to do was keep the law better. If they were here in Babylon because they had not kept the law, then by keeping the law, they could go back. Jeremiah had given them some pointers in that direction. But here God says, no, I'm actually going to make a new covenant with you. So it's good to keep the law, but I've got something new and better. Think how disorienting that must have been to them. When all of the physical trappings were taken away from them, they still had the law to remind them that they were the people of God, that God had made a covenant with them, even if they had broken that. And now God says, well, I'm going to do something new again. The future for the Jews isn't going to be better by keeping the law better, but rather through loving God. And that took some getting used to for them. They're not going to have a better future through the law being imposed upon them, but through it being part of their hearts, being just burned into their minds that this is who they want to be and how they want to live. And I think, again, this is somewhere that we can get caught out. We can sit in our homes and we can say, oh, maybe I should be at the church building. Maybe I really just want to be singing with people. I really feel guilty for missing out on Bible class. And I think they are all good things, just as keeping the law for the Jews was a good thing for them. And they are good things. But if our focus is on restoring the old normal, restoring what used to be, rather than on our relationship with God, then we're going to miss the point of the whole exercise. If we're not able to deepen our relationship with God in new ways during a pandemic, and instead we just long for the old ways, then I think we have the same challenges that Israel had during their exile. Because God's new covenant is to deepen His connection with our hearts and with our minds, to deepen His relationship so that He will be our God and we will be His people. We're going to take the Lord's Supper in a moment. And it's significant that at His final meal, Jesus makes reference to Jeremiah 31:31. He says, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood." Jesus was saying, this is the time. This is it. It's happening. I am rescuing you from exile. You don't have to drift anymore. I'm giving you an anchor to have relationship with God. This is it. This is your anchor. That you can enter into relationship with God, that you can love your neighbor, that you can receive forgiveness, that there's no barrier between you and God, and that you can make the world a better place. That you can participate in the peace and the prosperity of your city. And so as we navigate through uncertain times, make a commitment not to retreat into your personal bunker, not to develop a critical spirit as you look out at what's going on around you and say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. But rather, don't despair. Don't go and join what's wrong. Continue to live as a faithful child of God, seeking the well-being of those around you. And if your heart and if your mind are committed to that relationship with God, then you will influence the world more than the world will influence you. And that's what it means to live as God's people in exile. That's what it means to drift with a purpose. And so I pray that this week you'll commit to spending time with God, that you'll commit to pray for the peace and the prosperity of your neighbors on your street, in your town, and in the city. And as we do this, we live up to our mission as the people of God, living in exile, living adrift in the culture of the United States in 2020. Drifting, but secure, because God is our God and we are His people.
Bum 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 bum.